Thank you guys so much for having us today. So essentially, this is Prenny and myself. We're from the company Matrak. So we provide basically we've got sort of a materials and progress tracking system for the construction industry. And we were sort of asked to give a bit of a chat today, just to sort of talk about a little about sort of our experience, but also about how sort of technological innovation and everything sort of often happens from a sort of a development perspective, and also to look a little bit at the construction industry itself and how it's been developing. So yeah, feel free to shoot through any questions on Zoom or anything as you go. We'll also have a proper Q&A session at the end. Very happy to keep it pretty informal. I think no sound.
Does everyone else have sound? Can everyone else hear us just fine?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Cool. That's good. All right, cool. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, Hannah, if you're able to help, then cool. Thanks. Sweet. So essentially, the way that we got started was that my brother and our he was working for our dad's window installation company. So basically, they had about 12 people on a project that were receiving windows that were coming from overseas, and they essentially had to get all of the panels installed. But being curtain wall panels, there was some really strict rules around which ones needed to be installed in which order, and they had extremely limited visibility about what was being sent to site and how it was being packed and shipped. And so what that meant was that they might install a few in a row and then realize that they were missing the next panel. And then they'd have to run up and down all the different levels to try and physically find whether it had been sent in a stillage that was maybe on the wrong floor, or maybe it was shipped but they found it and then it had been reordered. So basically just a lot of confusion. And so because he was also a bit of a techie, he built just a mobile app for our dad's company to keep track of their windows. And but basically just as something over the weekend, just for a bit of fun. Some people's idea of fun. And yeah, and so what kind of happened was that first the suppliers got really excited because they needed him and get visibility of where the installers were at the website and what reorders had been requested and all of that sort of stuff. Obviously, the installers found it really useful because they knew what had been shipped to site and what was packed. But then the builder actually surprised us by coming up to him and saying that they would essentially want to pay for some software like that they have better visibility of their own supply chains. So that was pretty much how we first got our start. It was a bit of a surprise, to be honest. So essentially from, so to talk a little about sort of the frustrations that they were seeing today, what you're looking at here is a copy of just a standard delivery docket. So, so this handwritten stuff at the front is basically how they would have to coordinate their project. So a delivery would arrive, they get handed a sheet of paper that looks like this, and they'd have to sort of tick off or try to keep track of what had been sent on what day. And then if there was, again, anything missing or damaged and reordered, they'd just have to go through pages of these bits of paper that they would be keeping in their tool belt to try and work out who had sent what. And some of the emails which have been redacted from back at that time just kind of give you an indication of how poorly this process was working. And to be honest, still works like this on a lot of construction projects, unfortunately. Was that the green section below, basically someone had missed a tower crane and then they were arguing about whether or not the delivery needed to be picked up by this crane at the time or not. and then who's, who's paid for it. Yeah, and that's pretty typical. And
Interrupt. Could everyone please put mute on your microphones? We're getting a lot of extra sound.
Maybe if we go into the participant list and just mute.
that is a good idea. If I go,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just mute everyone.
Great. Okay, that sounds good. All right, thanks, guys. Yeah, so that was a pretty interesting experience, sort of seeing how difficult a lot of people were finding it to do really fundamental parts of their job. One of the other really interesting things that came up around this time when we were doing some of this investigation was that a lot of people really felt like this was sort of the best way that you could do business, and that the only way that you could do business. And a lot of people that we spoke to actually said that the reason that there was this lack of transparency and that it was so hard to coordinate materials and understand what was being sent when was because the manufacturers, for instance, might really like and might sort of have some commercial advantage if there's not much visibility about what they're doing. And Prenny, you actually spent quite a bit of time in China working with a bunch of manufacturers. Would you be able to talk a little to how they saw this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So we spent some time in China speaking with manufacturers and touring the factories, and you know, sitting in Australia, a lot of the times we assume that they shroud their processes in secrecy and they don't really want us to have visibility of what's going on in their factories. But it's more often the case is that it's not that easy even for them to get information or granular level information about the progress of any of their projects. And so when someone in Australia asks for the progress of you know a certain project, they have to physically go into the factory, speak to the foreman or the supervisors, and try and deduce the actual progress of a project, and then feed that back to their customers in Australia or wherever else in the world they have their customers. And so there's a lot of there seems to be a lot of you know issues within the factories in China as well in terms of granular level information, and the fact that everything is written down on pieces of paper. There are stacks of paper, quite literally that thick, that follow material around a factory floor from process to process, and it's just very pen and paper driven at this stage. So yeah.
Yeah, so to give one really really interesting example that I think surprised us a lot as we're sort of doing some of this research. So for a lot of top tier builders even today in Australia, they called out that often the process for the joinery and sort of woodwork defects was that if someone went through a room and realized that some of the materials was damaged or it had been sent to site and it had an issue and it needed to be reordered, the approach that they would take would be that they would find a loose scrap of wood, write in pen or pencil, you know, this cupboard is damaged and needs to be reordered. And then they would put that in the top drawer of the kitchen. And apparently it was just well known that, you know, when you're doing site walks and stuff like that, check in the top drawer of the kitchen and that will give you your joinery defects that you need to manage. Obviously this is before Aconex Field, I guess, was super popular, but I mean, still happens sort of on some job sites anyway. But then the problem would be that every couple of weeks the cleaners would come through and they would go through every drawer and throw out all of the random bits and bobs. And so, as I'm sure you guys in particular would be really aware, they would get to the end of a job site and realize that there were some things that just hadn't been rectified yet that needed to be. And it all really came down to this fact that people kind of can have visibility of their own work to some greater or lesser extent, but being able to have visibility upstream and downstream so that the companies that you rely on also are on the same page had just been like this real sort of critical issue for the industry for a while. So around that time, this sort of the period that Prenny joined us, we had built just enough to get, and we'd done it sort of enough research to think that maybe we could sort of be able to solve the problem. But I guess the kind of key takeaway that we had at the time, which I think is important for any sort of process improvement or innovation, I guess, is just realizing that we didn't really know very much. We knew a little about window installation for specific companies and for specific projects, but we had no idea how different trades would work, how different types of companies would work. We certainly didn't really understand how different countries and things like that would work. So essentially around that time, we pulled our brains and we were like, okay, maybe this is the sort of thing people would want. We're like, okay, we'll have an app that can track what's happening to the materials. And then if we know what's happening to the materials, maybe we can do all this cool stuff with data so that they'll be able to run their job sites better.
Cool graphs, right? I mean, who wouldn't want cool graphs that have like 3 different things on them?
Oh, totally. Cool graphs with 3 different things like window frames to glass and ducts. Yeah, that's fantastic. Obviously, these designs were from before Prenny as head of design really joined us. It was pretty early on. But nevertheless, we sort of had something that we were super chuffed with, and we thought it would be a huge success. And we started taking it to a number of builders, and they told us in no uncertain terms that it was completely rubbish and that it would never work and would never get picked up by anyone. So we'll kind of pause that story there for a second. I guess what we've really seen in the industry over the past little while has been this absolutely sort of radical changes, especially in sort of point solutions to a lot of different areas in the industry. And so I guess I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons that we're starting to see these shifts in use of technology and changes to processes and so on within construction. Would you feel like giving a?
Okay, this is where you shine.
All right, thanks, man. All right, I'll give it a crack. Cool. So essentially, for a lot of different industries, as you guys are going to be super aware, and especially in government, technology has been around for many, many, many decades. Even just the ability to have a computer at your desk has mean the ability to coordinate information, to track stuff, to share stuff has become very, very sophisticated. There has been a lot of tools in construction, certainly from the 80s, especially around design and things like that, that mean that for people who do, I guess, have the privilege of working with computers all day, they are able to be able to better manage a lot of their processes, and a lot of 3D drawings and everything came out quite early on, and certainly around ERP and early sort of logistics stuff have been with us for quite a long time. But even as you guys would know, it was actually quite a while ago, fairly early on in the internet's sort of existence, that you started to see Autodesk and companies like Aconex really start to pop up. But they were quite hamstrung by the fact that they generally needed fairly beefy computers to use, or they might require internet connectivity. And so at best, they could work with, things like architects, and maybe eventually project managers on site once computers started to pop up on actual job sites. But even then, you might only have a handful of computers on site. So a lot of, and so what was really interesting was that during this period, all of these other industries where larger numbers of people, like whether you're looking at marketing or law or medicine or telecommunications, and again, government, a lot of these areas where larger numbers of people were day-to-day working on computers, it meant that the sort of level of tech sophistication was able to just continue to take off. Whereas for a lot of people, even as recently as when we started was in the mid 2010s, people on construction sites were still having to rely on pen and paper or blocks of wood. So that has only really started to change about 10 years ago, once you started to see ubiquitous access to smartphones with internet access and tablets and things that were able to do a little bit of, whether it's viewing drawings or taking photos and recording defects, and certainly sort of health and safety was like a huge piece as well, that started to push up. But for construction, compared to a lot of other industries, this is all very new when you talk about having sort of fully connected workforces. So what's sort of come from that now, though, is that there's been these absolutely enormous trends that have been empowered by this uptake of tech. Some of them are basically expanding on some of the things that have been around for decades from sort of a design perspective, but some of them are very much sort of site and factory driven, which makes them quite new. So one of the big trends, which has been around for probably 15 or so years in terms of being fairly standard, is increasingly overseas procurement of materials. And even that in itself was only really enabled by the fact that there was the technology to be able to coordinate and find and connect with these different companies. It was extremely, extremely rare to see very much overseas procurement before the internet, just because the coordination of, getting drawings back and forth was so prohibitive before then. Sort of going on from that, in areas around sort of obviously modular and prefab construction has just completely started to take off. Also, one that I know that is really close to the VBA's heart is things like material provenance and certification tracking. It's the sort of thing that I think for a lot of us today seems like a no-brainer. You should absolutely have access to that data about the types of materials that you're working on. But if you were to look back 20 years ago, a lot of the times getting that information when you might have to go down a couple of layers of subcontractors was just extremely hard. And the idea of actually being able to track, the results of factory inspections and store that data somewhere that is then accessible to people that might be in a different country.
Hey, Janice. Exactly. Good. How are you? Let me just put my camera on.
Yeah, I'll say how to. Sorry, Suzanne. I'll just mute you. Oh, good.
It's okay. I'll just leave this.
Cool. There we go. Sweet. Sorry about that, guys. And so some of them, for instance, BIM-driven manufacturing is basically, as you guys are going to be super well aware, taking a lot of the stuff that happened around sort of the 3D modeling and just looking at how far that can be pushed through the supply chain, and how that can actually then even coordinate with the ways that particular machines are actually cutting material based on sort of these 3D models that have their origins in BIM. I'm sure a lot of you guys might have also seen, in fact, if we'd thought about it more, I would have loved to show a video demo, some of the ways that genetic algorithms are being used to actually almost completely autonomously do the design of construction projects. So you might be building a lab, you might know that it needs a certain amount of ventilation, you need a certain number of desk areas, and they need a certain amount of, natural sunlight, for instance. And then it will essentially just grow a whole range of different lab configurations for you to choose from, rather than having to design them yourself, which is just a game changer. And then obviously for the actual life of the asset, once it's been handed over, having the ability to use, whether it's something as simple as QR codes and barcoding, or sensors that can actually detect things like, for instance, the wind velocity on particular panels on a project, to make sure that if they were certified for a certain wind load, as an example, that matches what they're seeing in practice, or similar sort of sensors that are able to sit on sort of ventilation and mechanical units to proactively identify if there seems to be an issue based on the amount of vibrations they have and so on. So it's an area that's moving extremely quickly. And I think probably one of the big reasons for that, so I realize I'm talking quite a lot. Thanks, Prenny. So one of the big reasons for that is because construction is such an enormous industry, And we are really talking about only the last, 10 to, well, maybe really only really the last sort of 10 years that you've been able to have the full breadth of people who work in the construction industry actually have access to the potential to use technological tools by virtue of having sort of smartphones and so on. And so as a result, what I think we're going to continue seeing is that for especially a lot of investors and sort of private equity firms and so on, when they look at all of the different industries globally that have gone through these huge tech revolutions, construction is really being seen as one of the last opportunities that they have to get on the ground level of actually, this huge revolution that's happening within an industry. And so I think that that's why we're going to continue to see an enormous number of different tech startups, some of which might be extremely useful and very and make a real positive impact. Some of which maybe not. Hopefully we turn out to be the former rather than the latter, but you never know. But I guess what it does mean is that the amount of change that we're likely to see in this industry is probably going to be at a higher rate than at some of the industries that have preceded it, just by the nature of sort of where it sits in terms of other industries. Cool. So following all of that, so we'll loop back to where we found ourselves in, actually only about 2 years ago, which is where we thought that we built this thing that was going to change the world, and everyone said, nah, it's complete rubbish. So essentially the kind of the steps that we took from that, similar to what was basically just doubling down on the fact that we had to accept the fact that we don't know everything or even necessarily very much at all. And so we had to really work with people to figure out what are the blockers, what are the things that would make this more practical for you. And we ended up landing on a pretty simple solution, which was the drawings. So everybody who works in construction, no matter whether they're in the factories, whether they're doing sort of final sign-off, they're going to have to be familiar with the drawings, and the drawings are always the most up-to-date source of information about what actually needs to be built. So rather than trying to do all this whiz-bang stuff about tracking materials with lists or graphs or any of this other stuff, we ended up deciding to actually just focus on how can we essentially make the drawings interactive so that you can look at a job site and you can actually see color-coded where the materials are in that construction process. And so that was then able to solve a lot of the problems that that my brother saw when he very first started working as a window installer, through to a whole number of general contractors and people overseas and so on, because they could look at the drawings, see where their work was at, see where the people upstream and downstream were at for them, and sort of basically have this this sort of digital record of everything that happens to particular materials through that life cycle. So so around this time, this is actually and as a result of that, actually I should call out, so there's just kind of a very small snapshot of sort of the network that started to get created, because you started to get all of these individual companies that would then be able to use these sort of tracking tools to keep a record of the materials that they were working on, and then they could share that with the other companies that were working on the same projects. And so we started to really start to get quite a bit of traction in that, which sort of indicated that we were probably on the right track. So around this time was when Prenny started working with us, and it'd be good for you to sort of tell people about your very first customer meeting, which was with Icon. And so they said, okay, we're going to try this out. We want to have better visibility of our supply chains. And so what was the response?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, by the time that I had joined, we were well on our way to helping Icon with our first project with them. And even though there was a lot of resistance early on, we did manage to help them, deliver a project like the slide suggests, 2 months ahead of schedule. and so there was from that, there was a lot of positives that came from it, but there was still resistance to change. And there was another project manager, not the gentleman in the photo here. There was another project manager who I was going to be working with firsthand, and the first thing that he saw, or rather the first thing that he said when he sort of saw our product and what we could do was, "Oh, this will never work. No one will ever use this in construction." And it was, it just goes to show the amount of resistance there is to change, especially in an industry that's baked into their processes. And
it was an interesting one too, because a lot of it was about, the installers are too stupid to use technology, so it's never going to work.
Yeah.
And
no one in China would ever use this and share their information, and just a lot of assumptions, really. But we decided to get our hands dirty and jump in and try and solve the problem.
Yeah. So I'll just put one last one with that.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Essentially, so they'd run a project with a couple of companies, one supplier and one installer, working on joinery, and they'd hit all sorts of troubles. And so then, as kind of a last resort, they were like, let's try these, random kids that, try to do something a bit weird. And so it was actually the same team that worked together, but just by having this sort of technology, even though there was a bit of reticence at the start, it ended up going extremely smoothly, and they were able to finish 2 months ahead of schedule. And what was really interesting was that the project manager that had originally told Prenny at his very first customer meeting with us that it would never work, ended up becoming such a big advocate that he came back to us to ask for us to build basically a whole new sort of custom piece of tech just for his next project. And so I thought that maybe a lot of the stuff that we've sort of talked about has been quite high level about this sort of idea of iteration and, essentially not knowing what the right answer is and then testing different things out. But I thought it would be good to use that as an example to really dive into a bit more depth about what that can mean in practice and how that process can kind of work.
Yeah.
So do you want to give a bit of an overview about what the brief was, what they sort of asked us to do?
So essentially, we were looking at helping them to digitize and provide some form of automation toward their scheduling. And so the first thing that we did was to try and figure out what the actual problem was. Now, when we first started, he was highly resistant to trying to, he didn't believe that we were going to be able to solve much of his problems. But then we delved into it quite a bit. And so if you have a look at the screen here, Microsoft Project was a tool that was commonly used, or that he used on his projects. And MS Project isn't really a program that just anyone can sort of pick up and use that easily.
I guess just to give you a little context, so essentially the problem that they had was they've got on a particular job site, 50 to 60 different subbies, different trades that'll all be working, and they need to complete their work in a particular order. And if there's any delays to one company, that then means that the next company can't start work. So as an example, if the plasterer doesn't finish their work, the painter can't start. And so they essentially had a lot of issues with trying to keep abreast of, okay, you've got all of these different trades, especially during the fit out phase of construction, who's done what in which rooms, and which rooms are ahead of schedule, which rooms are behind schedule. Do we need to get extra staff on site? Do we need to, try and move our dates around? Do we need to manage this with our client?
Yeah.
How do we sort of control that?
Yeah, and so the program that they used at that point in time, and which they still do, is Microsoft Projects, and it's updated manually. So every week there's a meeting on site where a representative from each company has to come into a room, and they point to a chart on the wall and say, okay, this is 20% done. This part is complete. There's a problem on level 2. And so all of that information is then manually fed into Microsoft projects, and it's that Microsoft tool that then gives the project manager the overview of where the pinch points might arise, given the new information that was fed into it. And so it's a painful and cumbersome process. Everyone has to come into a room and provide that information, and it's just a very old way of doing things. And so my first job was to sit down with him and sort of understand how all of this it's an orchestra quite literally comes together, and how it sort of eventually materializes into a building. And so we looked at a couple of different options, and we started with paper, just sketching out a few possible scenarios, sketching out some of the directions in which we could follow. And this was a back and forth process for a good number of weeks before we were able to move on to something that was ready to be developed and implemented.
So is this the sort of stuff that you would draw in front of him, or would you sort of ask some questions, go away, and then come back and review design?
So there are little things you can draw in front of the client, but this is probably a bit more detailed than that. So you go to the client, talk, have a conversation, understand what the problem is, and then you go away and do a bit of work and try and put the pieces of the puzzle together. There is a misconception that especially in product design, that if you ask your customers what they want, they'll tell you. The reality, though, especially in product design, is that your customers don't necessarily know what they want. They just know the problems that they face. I think it was a quote by Henry Ford, who said, if I asked my customer what they wanted, they would have probably said a faster horse. And so it's quite relevant still in the world of product design to not necessarily rely on the user to tell you what the solution should be, but the user will tell you all the problems that they face, and then it's up to the product designer or the team that's designing the solution to actually delve into how that might be solved and put into a solution. Because people don't walk around with solutions in their heads and designs in their heads. So this is through this process of iteration back and forth with the customer, showing them some of the work that you've done, you tend to then align to a perfect type solution. There is no perfect solution to anything, but there are solutions that approach perfect but aren't exactly perfect. And there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat. So
would you be able to talk through maybe what we're looking at on the screen then in terms of these designs?
Yeah, absolutely. So the image on the left, the far left image is an example of their current schedule. And so the first thing I did on that image was to draw so each line on that table is a task that has to be performed by somebody, either a tradie or an external company, or it's a task essentially that needs to take place at a given time. Now, wouldn't it be nice if each one of those tasks had some form of a progress bar? And so that was the initial idea that I proposed to the client. And, that's when his eyes sort of lit up and he was like, whoa, yeah, actually, that'd be amazing. And so the second image, the image in the middle, is just a bit of a close-up of what those graphs or charts could look like. And then the third image is transposing all of that data onto the floor plan, which we already have in our product, by the way. So by this point in time, Shane and the team had already perfected the floor plan. The floor plans are widely used, by most of our clients and our customers. And so now what I'm trying to do in this scenario here is tie up the schedule with the actual floor plan for it to be an added sort of feature to our actual product.
So essentially, instead of having them tick off materials on the drawings, they're now ticking off the apartment for a particular task.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so the initial problem was that keeping Microsoft projects up to date was quite cumbersome. And so what we tried to do was to say, okay, if the subbies that are performing the tasks had an app which they could just hit update on, that app would then feed that information through to this view here, and all of those bars can in real time be updated. That would then save the need for a weekly meeting where one representative from every company has to sacrifice an hour to come into the boardroom and provide an update. Like, everything is at the tip of your fingertips, and you don't really need to, stop what you're doing and provide feedback to the project.
And it actually was kind of lucky timing too, because as obviously with COVID hitting, there's a lot of restrictions about how many people you can have in a room and everything anyway. So it's quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. So people are able to perform their job as per normal and just update their work on their phone, and then that information is relayed to where it's found important in the upper management of the construction companies, and people can see whether they're on track, where they're sort of lagging behind.
So after you guys have been working together for a few weeks, going through different designs and eventually sort of honing in on something that the PM got excited about.
Yeah.
Where did you end up? What was sort of next?
So we ended up with this as our final designed product, where it was just a more updated sort of look at what Microsoft projects could look like, and in our opinion should look like.
Yeah.
But we then took that into our product and said, okay, you can import your MS project file, and then this is where you can, it's dynamic in this situation. It's not static. All of the bar charts or the bar graphs over there are filled dynamically when someone updates their phone. If someone hasn't updated it in a while, you can hit request update, and that sends a message to that particular company to say, hey, the boss would like an update. And
I guess just to go a little bit more high level than just sort of our little piece of the puzzle, I guess. One of the cool things for any of this sort of work is that if you want to sort of implement something that's going to be new and a bit different, it's really easy to sort of sit in a room, come up with a big design, and then spend a huge amount of time and resources and sort of change management trying to get people to do something differently, only to get to the end and realize that what you built isn't actually what people wanted. And so, especially for us as a really, really small team, having that process of doing a lot of those tests with pen and paper, it meant that by the time, we got to the point where somebody's like, I really want this, I'm desperate for it, we could just make, the most important pieces first, knowing that it was going to add a lot of value, which I think is a really interesting approach, because I think for myself personally, like with sort of my experience with sort of older school software development and stuff, I guess, which is how a lot of sort of older school projects have traditionally been done, where there might be like a year's worth of design, and then after that they'll spend a year worth of building it and then a year worth of implementing it. Is that by the time you get to implementing it, often sort of the situation's changed, or it turned out that there was misunderstanding in some of those early designs, and then you end up with something that's a bit
Irrelevant.
rubbish. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
that's quite literally why you're constantly in touch with your users on the ground, is to make sure that relevance is maintained, and that the product that you put out at the end of the day is relevant. We've got a question, and we can either answer the questions now or wait till Q&A.
Yeah, we've got Q&A in a second, so I'll just answer that one when we get to Q&A in a second. But yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I guess kind of just to sort of wrap up from that before we get into questions. So I guess the key takeaway, I think, for me, and sort of step back at a broader level, is just that we know that there's a huge amount of changes happening in the industry, but if you spend too much time sort of just trying to come up with the solution in one hit, it's pretty much definitely always going to be wrong. But instead, if you do little pieces that you know are also definitely going to be wrong, but at least they're a little piece, then your next one can be a little less wrong and a little less wrong and a little less wrong until eventually you end up with something good. And I think just for me personally, probably the most exciting part of this whole journey to date has been around the fact that everything that has been built has really come from the actual construction industry, because we really didn't know a lot going into it, but being able to work so closely with so many different suppliers and installers and manufacturers and builders and everything has meant that what has sort of come out of it has been more about what's sort of important for everybody else, rather than just what we thought might look cool. Awesome. So thank you guys so much for that so far. So we've just got about 15 minutes for questions, and I will start with the first one. If I can find the chat window, here we go. Cool. So from Ronnie, with the tracking of materials reliant on people instead of sensors, are there issues with who are responsible to trigger counters not updating it regularly? So that is a fantastic question. So one of the things for us is that all of these different handover points between different companies already exist, but it's just that at the moment they're mostly mediated by emails and phone calls and so on. So if you have manufactured some work and then you need to pack it and then you want to ship it, you have to record those steps, because generally speaking, you're going to get paid based on what you've shipped. And so by having people take their existing processes where they say, okay, we've completed up to this point, and now I'm going to record that in a system that everybody else is across, then it means that they get the benefits of that visibility without us having to change their processes too much.
Sorry, to add to that as well, is that we've been very conscious throughout the development of the product, in that we're not trying to develop a product that would be mandated. And so it's not about someone at the top of the chain forcing the people or the companies below them to use the product, but rather, if our product is actually genuinely useful to the company using it, then they would want to, they find the benefit, or there are benefits of them keeping their progress up to date. And that helps them with invoicing. It helps them with staying on track, and just project management in general.
And one last one on that census question as well, because some of the suppliers that we've worked with have played around with using different sensors as well. And one of the things that they actually struggled with was the fact that even with a sensor, they still need to physically check things, because you might put a sensor on a piece of material and then take it to the right location so it looks like it's been correctly installed. But even though the sensor says, hey, I'm installed, if a human walks past, they might realize that it's not at all been installed correctly. It's not ready to go out. Maybe there's a huge issue with the materials or something. And so you still need those human checkpoints at each step to say, is it defective or is it correct? And at those points, if they're using a system, then they can sort of keep it up to date from there. Cool. Hopefully that answered that question.
Great question, though.
Yeah, fantastic. So you guys are welcome to ask more through. Oh, here we go. We've got another one. Cool. Yeah, no, that sounds great. Feel free to ask more questions. So, so Ronnie's just said, mentioned at the start of the scenario about tracking defects with paper in the top drawer. Can you tell us a bit more about how your app deals with this? Yeah. So basically, the core of Matrak is that we've got a record for every single material that's needed on a job site, and we actually generate that bill of quantities from the drawings now, which is how that all works, so that we can make it interactive on the drawings. And so because you've got that full bill of quantities of everything as it goes through the supply chain, each individual can tick off what they're working on. But similarly, if they tick something off and it's been defective or damaged, they can use the same system to do that. And what makes it really kind of a bit unique is that because we have the suppliers and the installers on the system at the same time, if the installer says, hey, this is damaged and I need a replacement, the manufacturer gets a notification and it can, and then they can ship a replacement part straight to the installer. Similarly, and this is actually probably more relevant for you guys, if something has been manufactured and you might have third-party certifiers or inspectors that are going through and checking off all of those products, it means that when it comes to installation, you can actually see, well, who did the tests, when did it go through each of its checkpoints, what inspections were done, and you've actually got this sort of history of everything that's happened to those materials, including sort of in-factory defect testing, all the way through the supply chain until the property owner sort of takes control of it. Cool. So yeah, hopefully that answered that question.
Feel free to ask questions by unmuting yourself as well.
Yeah. I did mute everyone, so you're welcome to unmute yourselves as well if that's easier.
Awesome. More.
Oh yeah, we've got one more coming.
Do we?
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
Cool. Can I clarify that you now could track more than materials? For example, you mentioned that you could track who is doing what in which room, which means your app also tracks project schedules and milestones. Include cool. Yeah, so that's really good question. So just to answer the last part first, we made a really concerted decision at the very start of when we were working on this that we didn't want to track people because there's a whole lot of ethical stuff around that and sort of pressure that bosses or, especially factory workers and stuff could get based on, how many hours did a person spend on which activity. So humans doing work, we don't track, but we do track not only the materials that go through that supply chain, but as you rightly called out, we've recently started tracking the tasks that need to be completed for a particular apartment or room. So you might have a task that says that the HVAC system needs to be properly tested, or that the electrical system needs to be properly activated, and those sort of tasks can still be ticked off by a subcontractor on each room as they go, and then you have that sort of full vision of where each room is at in the fit out space. Yeah. So we've just had another question. How do you manage your records at the completion of project and any learnings? So for completion of project, basically the data is just there for whoever set up the project. So it might be the GC, but it might just be a supplier that just wants to track their own supply work. So basically they have access to that data forever. And if they want to share it with their clients, which might be the property owner, they're welcome to. And we do have some integrated property developers that we work with, so they've just got access to that data that they can use for asset management. And actually Reese is a big customer of ours, so they use it for so after handover and sort of replacements and reservicing, they've got access to the data about what was shipped and what was installed.
We'd love to explore, how we might be able to contribute towards facilities management.
Yeah, totally.
And all of that as well.
In terms of any learnings, did you want to take that one?
For the completion of projects, I'm not entirely sure what that entails. No, I don't really think I have anything to add to.
There actually was one really interesting one on that, which, I mean, it's all sort of related, I guess. It was about how there was an example of a company that we work with that supplied an enormous amount of materials to a project. And then they found out, you know, many months afterwards, that there was an issue with one of the products that they'd supplied. And historically, what they've had to do was, you know, go through all of their old emails to find all of the old Excel spreadsheets that they had mailed, and then use that to try and find information about the individual products that were used and where they were used and when they arrived and which batch they came from and so on, to work out which ones needed to be replaced after the building was live. So that was actually a big surprise for us, because we didn't really intend for the system to be used for this purpose, but the fact that they were able to just go into the system, search for all materials of this nature, and then they had this view of what needed to be replaced, that ended up being something that was super useful for them, which I wouldn't have really expected. It was pretty cool. So we've got another question from Peter, which is, do you find that the different users prefer different views, e.g. floor plans versus progress bars? Are there other ways that different people in the process use the system differently? That's definitely a Prenny question.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have, there are different views for catered for different users. You have a user type that is more office oriented, and so there's a desktop view where in which you can get quite granular with the data and the details. Then you also have users that are on the ground, and so the installer, for example, might have a mobile view which is more catered toward updating information rather than digesting information. So we kind of look at it as data creation and data consumption from a user's point of view. But even within an installation company, you might have the installer who's on site, and their view is the mobile view where they're quickly saying, okay, these 3 rooms are done. But the same company has someone in the office who would need more than just a mobile view, and they want a desktop view. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes, definitely, depending on the user type, there are different views.
And one of the surprises on that actually has been that some companies only, if you've got even just the installer and the manufacturer working together, then for some builders, for instance, they just want to make sure that those two are playing nice and that everything's getting managed. So they may not even need to log into the system, because if they're getting a weekly email that says the right amount has been shipped and the right amount has been installed and these defects have been reordered and it's all on track, then even just getting an email might be the most useful view for them. Whereas other people might want to dive into reports and do all this analysis and stuff that not everyone needs to do. Yeah,
and then the second half of the question as well, are there other ways that different people in the process use the system differently? You could also have, like, we're currently in the process of revamping or iterating our dashboard. And in the dashboard view, we're looking at all the different types of ways in which a user might be able to set up information that's important to them. So, reporting on square meterage installed for progress claims, for example, might be one. Installation rates might be another. Deliveries might be another. So, yeah, there are so many different stakeholders and user types in construction from start to finish. I don't think we'll ever have a shortage of problems to try and solve. So yeah, great question though.
Oh, cool. So this question is if we have clients interstate across Australia or local to Vic. So we I'm just going to boast for a second, if that's all right.
All of the above.
Yeah, so we just hit our 100th project ever. We've done a number of projects in the UK and the US, and we've just got our first one in Hong Kong that's kicking off. About close to 40% of our customers are actually based overseas now because of the international nature of supply chains in Australia. But the bulk of the projects that we've done to date have been in Victoria and New South Wales, with just a smattering of projects in Queensland and WA, and ACT. But I think that's about it for Australia at the moment. But it's actually one of the coolest part about starting in Victoria specifically is that it is this huge international sort of leader from a construction process and construction software perspective as well. And it's been really, really cool that, especially in Europe, there was a big surprise that even though there's some areas, say with BIM adoption, where the UK is way ahead of some other parts of the world, particularly like the States or something, there's a lot of areas in terms of just coordination of different trades and stuff like just-in-time delivery and logistics and warehousing that the Victorian in particular construction industry is just, has a lot of lessons that the rest of the world can learn from. So that's been pretty cool.
There were those two, I think, and then we should probably...
Yeah, these are all great questions. So we've got, so when we mentioned projects, did we custom make the app for them? No, and in fact, if you guys want just a random plug, but you're welcome to just go in and have a play. So if you go to matrak.com.au, what was that sending? No, maybe I can't send. Everyone, yeah. Cool. So then you can actually just sign up for free and just have a bit of a play around with the system. So basically people can just upload drawings and just use the app. We don't really make anything custom. It's just sort of the same system for anyone that wants to use it.
Similar offering from another competitor?
Not that we're aware of, which is it really talks to that big surprise that we had at the start, because half the reason that we didn't even want to invest the time and our weekends and our social lives into trying to build this thing in the first place was because we're like, man, Autodesk is enormous, Aconex is enormous, Procore is enormous. They're definitely going to do this before we get a chance to. But no, we kept doing little bit by little bit by little bit, and no one sort of caught up with us yet, I guess. There's definitely tools that do materials tracking quite well, but generally they do it within a company. So you might have a really good view of your own manufacturing, but then as soon as it leaves the manufacturing plant, you don't know what's happening on site. You don't know what's happening with the GC or what the tester's getting results for your work. And similarly, like defecting, there's Matrak does defects and Aconex Field does defects, but they only track the defects. They don't track the materials that are good, and they don't. So I think that the fact that it's sort of this network that anyone can join in on is pretty unique. And the fact that we generate the bill of materials from the drawings so that there's no effort to actually get started to use it is something that's really unique as well. So I would say no.
Awesome. Bang on 3 o'clock as well.
Cool. Cool. So thank you guys so much for your time. If you do have any further questions or anything, I'll just put my email address in as well, shane@matrak.com.au. Feel free to send us any questions. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to chat to everyone today. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll speak to you guys later.